Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, June 16th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Milley predicts a long, violent counteroffensive. So, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, predicted on Thursday that Ukraine's counteroffensive will be long and very violent following a meeting of military officials in Brussels. So, Milley made the comments when asked how long he expects the counteroffensive to last. He said it was premature to put a timeline on the battle. Milley said, quote, "This is a very difficult fight. It's a very violent fight, and it will likely take a considerable amount of time and at high cost," end quote. So the Biden administration has been pushing for this violent counteroffensive as it is explicitly opposed to a ceasefire and peace talks, and that position was outlined by Secretary of State Antony Blinken earlier this month. Milley claimed that Ukraine has been making steady progress in its counteroffensive, but the battle lines have not changed much since Ukraine launched the assault early last week. Ukraine has said that it's taken some villages, but if you look at the map here, this is from South Front, and you could see this is the military situation on Thursday, June 15th. And there was fighting, all along in the Donbass region and in Zaporozhye in the south there. The battle lines, Ukraine has claimed to have captured some small villages, but again, things have remained pretty static overall, and it does sound like there's been a lot of heavy fighting, so there's probably a lot of casualties. According to the New York Times, they reported on Thursday that it's been 3 days actually since Ukraine claimed any gains, and Ukraine's deputy defense minister acknowledged that it was very difficult to advance, particularly in the southeast in that Zaporozhye Oblast. So Asia Times, I saw this today, but they reported this on June 10th, that American and European military observers in Ukraine described Ukraine's attempted counteroffensive as a suicide mission because of the way they were attacking Russia's positions. So this was again, this is Asia Times, and they quoted a senior European officer who said, quote, "If you want to conduct an offensive and you have a dozen brigades and a few dozen tanks, you concentrate them and try to break through. The Ukrainians have been running around in 5 different directions. We tried to tell them to stop these piecemeal tactics, define a main thrust with proper infantry support, and then do what they can," end quote. So they're saying, again, that they were, I guess, too broad of an attack when they don't really have the armor for it. And that report said that Ukraine lost 38 tanks, including numerous German-made Leopard 2 tanks, on June 8th when they launched an attack because they sent these tanks into minefields without deploying mine-clearing vehicles first. So just in one night, they lost 38 tanks. The U.S. has already announced a new weapons package to replace Bradley and Stryker armored vehicles that Ukraine has lost in the offensive, and Ukraine has been asking for more tanks, including the Leopard 2. Speaking alongside Milley on Thursday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin downplayed Ukraine's losses of equipment, that is, claiming that Russia was showing different pictures of the same damaged vehicles. Austin said, quote, "This is a war, so we know that there will be battle damage on both sides. I think the Russians have shown us that same 5 vehicles about 1,000 times from 10 different angles. But quite frankly, the Ukrainians still have a lot of combat capability and combat power," end quote. So at this conference in Brussels of military officials from more than 50 countries, this is known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. At this meeting, Austin stressed the need to support Ukraine for the long term. He said that the Netherlands and Denmark shared the progress that they've made on training Ukrainians on F-16s, but it's still unclear how many of these fighter jets Ukraine is going to get or when they're going to get there. We don't know those things yet. But more, open-ended commitments from the U.S. and NATO to keep supporting this war for as long as it takes, as they keep saying. All right, the next one here. The Czech president says that Russians living in the West should be monitored. So, Czech President Petr Pavel has said that Russians living in Western countries should be monitored similar to the way people of Japanese descent were in the US during World War II. So, he's comparing it directly to the way the US treated Japanese Americans during that war when they locked them up in internment camps. So, this is Pavel speaking to Radio Free Europe. He said, quote, all Russians living in Western countries should be monitored much more than in the past because they are citizens of a nation that leads an aggressive war. I can be sorry for these people, but at the same time, when we look back, when the Second World War started, all the Japanese population living in the United States were under a strict monitoring regime as well. That's simply a cost of war, end quote. So when asked what he meant by monitoring, Pavel said that Russians should be under the scrutiny of the security services. So during World War II, as I'm sure you all know, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's orders, the U.S. rounded up about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry and forcibly placed them in internment camps. The majority of these people were American citizens, and half of them were children. So that's what he's referring to. And I mean, it's just unbelievable that he would refer to that when, the U.S. has officially apologized for that. I think Biden mentioned it when he was in Japan recently, calling it a great shame or something. And then he's saying, you see what the U.S. did to the Japanese? Let's, round up some Russians. He didn't say directly put them in internment camps, but that is what he's referring to. And Zelensky has previously called for the collective punishment of Russians for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He was speaking more specifically about Russians living in Russia. Last year, he asked Western nations to ban all Russian travelers, and he said that the whole population of Russia was responsible for the war. And you imagine if that line of thinking was applied to the United States. I mean, the U.S. is still waging wars that most people in the country don't even know about. All right, so the next article here, Israel is monitoring black market arms smuggling from Ukraine. So this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and this is pretty interesting. The Israelis are worried about these weapons ending up in the Middle East. So the Israeli Defense Forces are monitoring arms smuggled out of Ukraine and weapons captured by Russia over fears that they could be used by Iran. A recent Pentagon report found insufficient tracking of weapons shipped to Ukraine via Poland. So on Thursday, a senior IDF commander expressed deep concern regarding the situation. He said it's challenging to build the picture and that they're seeing the signs of, weapons from Ukraine, I guess, ending up in the region. The IDF official said that there was a smuggling route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. The unnamed source explained weapons, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles, were placed on the black market by Ukrainian paramilitary forces for financial reasons. A second pathway the IDF keeps an eye on is Russia capturing weapons and providing Iran with the arms. The commander believes once the weapons make their way to Iran, the Islamic Republic will reverse engineer them. An intelligence official from an unnamed country told Newsweek that Russia shipped Javelin anti-tank systems to Iran last year. The outlet says that the source provided satellite imagery to corroborate the information, but Newsweek admits it could not independently verify the imagery, so who knows about these claims here. But I think the most interesting thing about this story is Israel saying that there's this smuggling path from, the Black Sea, I guess, through the Bosphorus Strait into the Mediterranean, and it's making it into the Middle East, I guess. And Kyle mentions again that this comes after the Pentagon Inspector General report that said there was failures in systems for tracking weapons. And again, this was on the in Poland where, I guess the weapons come in and then from there they ship to Ukraine. So they're saying they're not able to keep track of weapons in that process, let alone them, when they're actually shipped into Ukraine. So I'm sure that, this problem is much worse, than we can imagine when it comes to these weapons getting on the black market. All right, the next one here, U.S. lawmakers bill would give Russian central bank assets to Ukraine. So a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers introduced a piece of legislation on Thursday that would give President Biden the power to confiscate frozen Russian central bank assets and send them to Ukraine. So the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act was introduced in both the House and the Senate. According to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the legislation would provide additional assistance to Ukraine using assets confiscated from the central bank of the Russian Federation and other sovereign assets of the Russian Federation. So it sounds like, they're talking about in the statements on this bill, they're talking about reconstruction, but based on their description and some of the language, it sounds like that they're thinking they could use these Russian funds to continue providing, aid to Ukraine. So the US Justice Department has authorized the transfer of some private Russian assets to Ukraine, but taking funds from the Russian central bank would mark a significant escalation of Washington's economic war against Moscow. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank assets have been frozen by the US and its allies. And the legislation would also instruct President Biden to work with allies and partners to establish an international compensation mechanism to transfer confiscated or frozen Russian sovereign assets to assist Ukraine. European countries have been discussing the idea of using Russian assets to provide more funds for Ukraine. One idea I know that they're talking about, they're not saying that we should just give them the Russian money. They're saying that they should invest the Russian assets and then give Ukraine, the returns. But still, they have hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's money, and they're talking about, giving it to Ukraine. So that would be a pretty big, again, a big escalation of this economic war. And the bill would also give the State Department additional resources to work with partners and allies abroad toward the goal of confiscation of additional Russian sovereign assets in other countries. The House version of the bill was introduced by Representatives Michael McCall, Republican from Texas, Marcy Kaptur, Democrat from Ohio, Joe Wilson, Republican from South Carolina, Thomas Keene Jr., Republican from Jersey, Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican from Pennsylvania, and Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee. In the Senate, the legislation was led by Jim Reich and Sheldon Whitehouse. So it seems like, a lot of the top, McCall, you get the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee introducing this thing. I think it might have some legs. All right. The next one here, the U.S. and India are working to boost military cooperation. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan discussed boosting military ties with India during a visit to the country this week to prepare for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first official state visit to the United States. The White House said that while Sullivan was in India from June 13th to the 14th, he reviewed preparations for the upcoming official state visit of the Prime Minister and discussed a range of strategic, regional, and bilateral issues, including steps to advance the strategic technology and defense partnership between the United States and India. Modi has frequently visited the U.S. since he's become Prime Minister. But a state visit, it's like, more prestigious. It's more just symbolic, really, because it involves a formal invitation from the president and a state dinner, which is different than an official dinner or something. I don't know exactly, but it does mean something. And President Biden recently hosted South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol for a state visit. And, this highlights the administration's emphasis on this region, the Asia Pacific region. The U.S. is working to forge stronger military ties with India as part of its strategy against China. One of the big things that's happened in recent years was in 2020, the U.S. and India signed a military pact to allow the U.S. to share satellite data with India, and that helps New Delhi with surveillance of Chinese troops along the disputed border in the Himalayas, known as the Line of Actual Control. If you remember in the summer of 2020, or spring, I think it was June, Chinese and Indian troops clashed along this disputed border. The Chinese and Indian troops deployed in that region do not have guns. They fought with, sticks and clubs, but it killed 20 Indian troops and 4 Chinese troops. And after that, the U.S. and India signed this deal, and the U.S. is helping them surveil these Chinese troops. There was another clash in December 2022 that nobody was killed, but according to a report from U.S. News, India used this intelligence. The U.S. helped India with surveillance during this fight with Chinese troops. So it's pretty significant, this type of, cooperation. The Biden administration is also looking to sell more weapons to India in hopes of weaning New Delhi off Russian military equipment. Sources told Reuters ahead of Modi's visit, India's defense ministry approved the procurement of 31 U.S. made armed MQ 9B Sea Guardian drones. The U.S. has been pushing India to approve the deal, which is worth over $3 billion. The sale is expected to be announced during Modi's visit, along with the U.S. approval of manufacturing General Electric's engines in India for the country's domestically produced fighter jets. So this is all part of the strategy against China. And that's why the U.S. is kind of tolerating India buying all that Russian oil, still buying Russian military equipment. There was talk about sanctioning India, but there's no, India is very reliant on Russia, for military equipment. It's not like if they start trying to sanction India, India is not going to really, they're just going to move closer to Russia and maybe, China as well. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. military gets unimpeded access in Papua New Guinea. So the U.S. military has gained unimpeded access to sites in Papua New Guinea using a new military pact that Secretary of State Antony Blinken signed in the Pacific Island nation last month. AFP obtained a copy of the full deal, which confirmed that the U.S. can deploy troops and station vessels to 6 ports and airports in Papua New Guinea, including the Lambrum Naval Base in the northern part of the country. If you're looking at the map here, you see Papua New Guinea. I believe that naval base is around here in the northeast among these islands up here. So according to the text of the agreement, the U.S. can pre-position equipment, supplies, and material at the military sites. The U.S. will have exclusive use to some sites where construction activities can take place, signaling that the U.S. might build new bases in the Pacific Island nation. The U.S. military had a significant presence in Papua New Guinea during World War II, and the new agreement is part of the Biden administration's strategy to prepare for a future war with China in the region. U.S. military sites in Papua New Guinea could be used to resupply U.S. forces in Guam, in the Philippines, and, to resupply if there's a fight, going on over Taiwan. So PNG Prime Minister James Marape has come under domestic criticism for signing the deal. Their parliament still needs to approve it, from what I understand, but I think he's got the votes there, but there's been protests and stuff. And former Prime Minister Peter O'Neill said that the agreement has painted a target on Papua New Guinea. And, he's right. It's no secret that any U.S. military base in Papua New Guinea would become a potential target for China in a future war. General Kenneth Wilsbach, who's the commander of U.S. Pacific Air Forces, has said this outright. He recently told Nikkei Asia that the purpose of expanding in the Pacific is to give China more areas that it would need to target in a war. He said, quote, "Obviously, we would like to disperse in as many places as we can to make the targeting problem for the Chinese as difficult as possible. A lot of those runways where we would operate from are in the Pacific Island nations," end quote. So there you go. It is turning this country into a potential target if there's a future war. All right. The next one here, the U.S. says reports on potential Iran deal are not true. So the State Department on Thursday said that these reports about a potential agreement between the U.S. and Iran related to Iran's nuclear program are not true. This is State Department spokesman Matthew Miller. He said, quote, "With respect to Iran's nuclear program, there is no deal. The reports that there is a deal or some agreement or some other description, however you want to describe it, are not true," end quote. Miller's comments come after multiple media outlets have reported that the U.S. and Iran are close to a deal that would involve Iran pledging not to increase uranium enrichment in exchange for access to frozen Iranian funds. The two sides are also reportedly discussing a potential prisoner swap. On Wednesday, there was another report from the New York Times that quoted an Iranian official who called the potential deal a political ceasefire to reduce soaring tensions between the two countries. And Netanyahu has described it as a mini nuclear agreement. So Iran has confirmed that it's held indirect talks with the U.S. in Oman. And Oman's foreign minister on Wednesday said that the two sides are close to finalizing an agreement on Americans who are held in Tehran. And they said there is a seriousness to also reach a deal on Iran's civilian nuclear program. So those are comments from Oman, again, who's been mediating these talks. But despite all these reports and all these signs that they are working out a deal, the Biden administration continues to deny it. I think likely because of all the Iran hawks in China are going to give them a hard time over this. But, I don't know. Hopefully there's some sort of agreement. Maybe Iran gets some sanctions relief, just, eases the tensions and, again, those sanctions on Iran, just all they are doing is, hurting ordinary Iranians. All right. So the next one here, Israel will not punish soldier who killed Palestinian toddler. This article is from the Palestine Chronicle. The Israeli army decided that the soldier who fatally shot a 2-year-old Palestinian toddler in the Nabi Salah village will not face any disciplinary action, Israeli media reported. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that, according to an inquiry released by the IDF on Wednesday, the soldier mistakenly believed that the toddler, Mohammed Tamimi, and his father, Haitham, had fired at him. According to the Israeli military inquiry, the incident was triggered by a report of shooting near the West Bank settlement from a hill nearby this village. The Israeli army admitted to deficiencies in command, control, and communication among the forces on the ground, leading to erroneous decisions. On June 2nd, Mohammed Tamimi was with his father and mother in their car when a bullet fired by soldiers hit the boy's head and injured the father and his soldier. So he was rushed to the hospital and he died. Again, 2-year-old. I mean, just really horrible. And then nothing's going to happen to the soldier who killed him. We might see more reports of people, who were there and who could tell the story of what really happened there. From what I understand, witnesses said that, there was no gunfire right around there. All right, the next one here, U.S. deploys F-22s to the Middle East aimed at Russia. This is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. Washington sent F-22 Raptors to the Middle East in a show of force eyeing Moscow. So the U.S. is claiming that Russian aircraft have been acting unsafely in the skies above Syria. And according to Russia, recently has accused the U.S. of targeting Russian aircraft in eastern Syria. On Wednesday, U.S. Central Command issued a statement saying that a squadron of F-22s was deployed to its areas of responsibility, which stretches from North Africa to South Asia. The deployment shows the U.S. ability to reposture forces and deliver overwhelming power at a moment's notice. General Michael Kurilla, who's the CENTCOM commander, said, quote, Russian forces' unsafe and unprofessional behavior is not what we expect from a professional air force. Their regular violation of agreed-upon airspace deconfliction measures increase the risk of escalation or miscalculation, end quote. So, they're sending planes there and blaming it on Russia. I don't know. Who knows what's going on here, but there's always a risk. That's a risk of the U.S. being in Syria, is provoking a conflict with Russia, because Russia's also there. Russian and American troops have encounters sometimes at checkpoints in northeast Syria. It's always a risk. All right, the last news story here. North Korea launches missiles after massive U.S.-South Korean drills. This is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This article is by Connor Freeman. So North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles in its eastern waters in a grave provocation on Thursday, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said. The short-range missile launches followed the 5th and final round of Washington and Seoul's largest ever combined live-fire joint military exercises. We keep hearing that phrase, largest ever military exercises, and this goes to show how high the tensions are on the Korean Peninsula. According to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff, North Korea's missiles were launched from Pyongyang and traveled roughly 480 miles. The missiles then landed in the sea between Japan and the Korean Peninsula within Tokyo's exclusive economic zone, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has said. So, commemorating the 70th anniversary of the two countries' alliance, the U.S. and South Korea conducted the combined annihilation firepower drills. They were the largest of their kind since they were first held in 1977. South Korea's defense ministry explained that each of the 5 rounds involved 2,500 South Korean and U.S. troops in about 610 military assets, including stealth fighter jets, attack helicopters, tanks, and drones from both countries. Pyongyang views these massive simulations on its doorstep as invasion rehearsals, which, that's kind of what they are. They say explicitly that they are simulating destroying military facilities inside North Korea. And these big war games, the U.S. and South Korea started doing them again last year, and they were paused for a few years, as a result of Trump going over there and shaking hands with Kim, and that there was dialogue between the North and the South, but that's all gone away, and tensions are just very high now. And there's no sign at all that the U.S. is going to change course on this policy. I think they want to give South Korea and Yoon, the new president, who's much more hawkish than his predecessor, they just want to give him whatever he wants. This way, the U.S. can station all these new military assets in South Korea, and they could kind of use that to intimidate China as well. The U.S. is going to be docking nukes, a nuclear-powered submarine, not nuclear-powered, sorry, nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea soon as part of this. And that's just a completely unnecessary provocation, because those submarines can be there off the coast of South Korea. And, because that's just what they do. They're all over the world at any time, secretly. So the only purpose of docking them openly is as a provocation. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Jonathan Cook, another act of terror, how the media do PR for Biden and Zelensky. We have one from Ted Snyder. While the West sees victory in Ukraine, the global South seeks peace. That's at the Libertarian Institute. One from Ramsey Baroud, permanent apartheid in Palestine. This is why Israel wants to reactivate E1 plan. One from Seymour Hersh. This is at SheerPost. It's a reprint of his Substack. Russiagate's missing pieces. And then our spotlight is from Fair, from Bryce Green. New York Times on Ukraine's Nazi imagery. It's complicated. So go check that out. That's about the New York Times having that story about the Nazi imagery used in the Ukrainian military. But that's everything, and that's it for the week. Go check out the blog too. There's a post there. I was on the Kim Iverson show the other day talking about, a lot of the stuff I've been covering here. So go check that out. That's it for me for the entire week. I will be back after the weekend. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate, or, just sharing the show, subscribing on YouTube, liking and commenting and sharing, our work, telling people about antiwar.com. That's really the most important thing you can do. So keep that up. But anyway, I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.